Hello and welcome to my Christian fiction podcast, where I share stories with you. Right now, you're listening to Buried Secrets, written and read by Eunice Wilkie. Chapter 18. October 2022. Mysteries from the Wild podcast. Draft notes for Buried Secrets series, episode 12, continued. We drive away from the stone circle and down the rough track. By now, we ought to know the location of every pothole, but it's impossible to avoid them. Although the Urquhart family mausoleum is only 3 miles away, the journey feels much longer on this unmade road. Once we cross the main thoroughfare through the strath, such as it is, we ascend the opposite hill. John parks in the unofficial parking space beside a forest track. 3 vehicles are already there. The barely visible footpath leading through the towering evergreens to the mausoleum remains beautiful, despite autumn's advance. The birch and rowan saplings have lost their leaves, but the rowans more than compensate for the loss with a lavish display of bright red berries. The mausoleum looms as suddenly and startlingly as it did before, still looking as if it had missed a turn for the nearest big city, got tired, and plonked itself down in the first available space. Today, without sunlight, its massive granite stones appear unrelentingly grey, which feels fitting for the occasion. The central door beneath the highest section is once again open, as it was on our last visit. But this time it's not broken. A man stands in the doorway, raising a hand in greeting as we approach. Jack Urquhart, in a tweed jacket that could be a twin of John's, has even donned a tie, though not a black one. His father, Colonel Urquhart, stands inside, nodding briefly at us before turning back to supervise the 2 men carefully manoeuvring a plain but new coffin into Donald Urquhart's burial slot. It's an exact process. The space is barely larger than the coffin, requiring precise alignment. The coffin scrapes as it enters the crypt. The workers murmur quiet instructions to each other, their voices echoing off the stone walls. The 2 Urquharts, John and I, stand still, watching in silence. The mausoleum's chilly, echoing interior still feels like an old church, but this isn't like any funeral I've ever attended. Even after the coffin is in place, the silence lingers. "Shall we fasten the hatch?" One of the workmen hesitates, glancing at the Urquharts as if expecting a blessing or some final words. Colonel Urquhart simply nods. "Close it," he says. The old metal hatch groans in protest as it's pushed shut, the harsh grating sound an unceremonious accompaniment to Donald Urquhart's burial. Is there some symbolism in that? When it's done, we see the plaque on the door. It's the same one that was there before. Donald Urquhart, 1931 to 1984. Rest in peace wherever you now lie. We file out into the cold, grey day. It's easier to breathe outside, and there's a collective sigh of relief as we leave the tomb behind. After a brief exchange, Colonel Urquhart departs, while Jack accompanies us back to the cars. No one speaks. Every footstep on pine cones and twigs feels amplified in the silence. I suspect neither John nor Jack is bothered by this. I feel like an intruder, caught between two friends who are comfortable enough with each other to say as much, or as little, as they wish. At last, Jack breaks the silence. If only it were that easy to bury his troubled legacy. It certainly casts a long shadow. I think of that shadow, the lasting heartache, the feuds, the violence stretching across generations. Would the Vasses and Urquharts have clashed regardless? Perhaps. One was the landlord, the other a family of rebellious tenants with a penchant for making a living through crime. John seems to be thinking the same. I'm not sure Donald Urquhart can be blamed for the Vass clan's choices. It's likely they would have found a grievance to fight over, whether with the Urquharts or someone else. And left bodies buried in secret graves behind them too, I shouldn't wonder, I add. Ahead of me, John chuckles. Melanie thinks that the Vasses have more hidden graves in the area, he explains to Jack. It's a theory we've discussed before. Jack sounds almost amused. Fresh material for another podcast series. But people don't just disappear without some explanation, John says. He's trying to protect his reputation, Jack teases. Can't have the police missing a string of undiscovered murders. It could become quite embarrassing. John shakes his head, but doesn't rise to the bait. At least bodies are concrete evidence of a crime, I say. They seem to be a treasure trove of information, even decades later. The more science advances, the harder it is to get away with murder. Physical evidence is hard to dispute, John agrees. Fingerprints and DNA are pretty conclusive, unless people get even better at planting them. Ever the optimist, I retort. Jack chuckles. Speaking of conclusive evidence, John tells me you've been challenging him to investigate whether the Bible is reliable. He glances at me as he speaks, then adds, I asked him if he'd considered the archaeological discoveries that support biblical accounts. Since the Bible purports to present real history, it would make sense for archaeology to uncover physical evidence of places and events recorded in it. I must admit, I've never really looked into this, I concede. Our footsteps crunch over the forest floor. John's voice rises above the sound. I'm ahead of you there then, Mel, he says sardonically. He's been ahead of me throughout this entire investigation into the Bible. He's far more thorough than I have ever been. What? Books on science and archaeology for your bedtime reading now? I ask him. I lent him some of mine, Jack interjects. How are you getting on with them? He asks John. I wonder what it would take to convince John that the Bible is true. Already he can't explain how so many undeniable prophecies have been fulfilled. He's also acknowledged that the design of the world and the complexity of human beings are best explained by the biblical account of a creator. It occurs to me that people can be presented with irrefutable evidence for something they don't want to believe and still reject it, simply because it doesn't suit their own ideas or agenda. But John hasn't reached that point yet. He's still searching, even if he doesn't like what he's finding, or, more accurately, the implications of the Bible being true. There's certainly impressive archaeological evidence supporting some biblical stories, he admits. But plenty of the Bible's history is already accepted as true. That doesn't prove the book is divinely inspired. We reach the cars parked by the forest track. Jack opens the door of his Land Rover and climbs in. He starts it up, and over the rumble of the engine, he says to John, "But the archaeological evidence is just another thing that you have to explain away in order to dismiss the Bible's claims." John and I get into his car, and I'm relieved when he turns up the heat. It's another small detail he's noticed about me, that I like to be warm. "Thanks," I say. "No problem," he responds. John and I head back towards the police station, while Jack drives in the opposite direction, up the track towards Strathavie House. "So, did you find any surprises in the archaeological evidence that supports the Bible?" I ask, as we drive through the trees. John exhales a sigh. "There are some archaeological finds that are hard to dismiss," he admits. "There's evidence for Noah's flood, and for the Exodus and the Israelite conquest of Canaan, to name a couple. But one of the most remarkable discoveries was the Dead Sea Scrolls, which included fragments of nearly every book of the Old Testament dating back centuries." "Why is that so significant?" I ask. "Because of its implications for Bible prophecies. It proves that the book of Daniel, which contains detailed predictions about world history, wasn't written after the events, which was the only explanation skeptics could come up with. And Isaiah chapter 53, which we learned in Sunday school, the passage about the sacrifice of Christ, was written long before Christ's time, yet it reads like an eyewitness account of his suffering." I don't ask John what he personally believes at this point, but I can tell his research has seriously challenged his dismissal of the Bible. Now the weight of fulfilled prophecy and archaeology stands behind it. No wonder he seems unsettled. As we continue down the now familiar road through the Strath, John tells me he's also been reading about the scientific insights found in the Bible, discoveries that modern science has only recently caught up with, such as the vast number of stars, the constellations, the water cycle, oceanography, and more. The sheer volume of supporting evidence seems overwhelming to me. But will John be overwhelmed and ultimately convinced? I know our theological discussions won't make the final podcast, unless I start a series on philosophical mysteries next. For now, I'll return to our earthbound mystery and recap where we're at. We have laid 2 skeletons to rest and uncovered a third, which remains unidentified. We have 2 suspects, Simon Vass and Joe Finch, connected to the various crimes at the dig site, including concealing evidence of a murder. What will the prosecutors make of the case against them? We have 2 men, father and son Murdo and Duncan Vass, who are likely connected to the 1977 murder. They will be questioned, but so far we lack conclusive evidence tying them to the crime. We plan to question Archie Martin, an in-law of the Vasses, about the 1977 murder, hoping he will reveal something crucial. He is a very frail old man. Time is of the essence. Will we be in time to question him? If so, what will be the outcome?